welcome. It's great to see everybody. My name is Liam. I'm the Director of Professional Counselling and Psychotherapy Seminars Ireland. And I'm super excited tonight that we're joined by Dr. Stephen Terrell. See how I've given you your official name, Steve? You're a doctor.
Yes, yes.
So people will be expecting a lot tonight now. Dr. Terrell, yeah?
Yes, I will remember that. I will remember who I am.
So Steve is going to be talking tonight, hopefully, about working with the unknown, exploring nonverbal trauma. So before you start, Steve, I'm just going to go through a few little things to make tonight as easy as possible.
Okay.
So if anybody has any technical issues, I think the easiest thing to do is just log off using the link provided and then log back on again. If the issues persist, please contact Mary. Mary's going to be on the end of her email. So Mary's email address is Mary, M-A-R-Y, @pcpsi.ie. And Mary will respond to any emails. What we'd encourage people to do as soon as possible, if you have any specific questions for Steve in relation to developmental trauma or working with developmental trauma, please send them in as soon as possible. You can use the Q&A function, which is at the end of the screen to the right. And I just want to say before we start that we're very lucky. We're very lucky and very grateful to you, Steve, for what you've done for us. Steve has started coming to Ireland this year. So for his training, transforming the experience-based brain. And we started the first training in Ireland in February. And we were kind of super lucky to get face-to-face before the pandemic hit. And then we've needed to continue online, which has worked out great, Steve. It's really been worked out really well. So the first graduates are going to finish in January. So that's going to be fantastic. And then Steve has very kindly agreed to come back and do the training again next year. So we're going to have TEB next year. I think it's May, September and December. It's going to be 3 modules. So anybody that's interested, you can send me or send Steve an email. My email address is Liam, Liam @pcpsi.ie. And we'd love to have you on board. And anybody looking to get a CPD cert for this webinar, Robert, you might post the link that people can purchase CPD certs if they need to. I think that's all, Steve. I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. So what I suggest is that you start talking away about working with the unknown, exploring nonverbal trauma, and I'll come in and ask a few questions. And I'm sure there'll be questions coming in and we'll take it from there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Liam. It's a pleasure to see you. I do miss being in Ireland every time I've been there, not only for TEB, but when we were there before. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people that are and probably the best food I've ever eaten. So it's good to be here today, even without the food. We would like, you could send some food over, Liam. We're going to be talking about developmental trauma. And developmental trauma, in itself is an interesting term because we didn't have that. That was not a recognition. We used to lean more on complex trauma, which meant that there were a lot of single incident traumas and they build up to and they create more of a complex system or a complex trauma coming through. Then Vanderholt, he is the first one. He came up, as far as I know, he was the first to start using the terminology developmental trauma here in the US, and it's just grown. exponentially. I mean, it everywhere. You see a lot of trainings now, a lot of stuff going on around developmental trauma. What makes developmental trauma so unique is that I see your developmental trauma, you're really, there's no roadmap where when I'm working with someone who has shock trauma or single incident trauma, you can look at them and say, okay, before this moment in time, their life was pretty well going along and they're able to use their memory. They can use, uh, we have two primary kinds. We think about implicit and explicit memory being more focused on autobiographical, and implicit being more like little bits and pieces of memory that may or may not. And then, we also have somatic memory, which is in our body. So I don't want to leave that one out of the. So I guess there's really three primary types. Um, so if I'm working with single shock or shock trauma, single incident or shock, I can say, what was your life like before? What was going on the morning of? What was going on the evening before? How was your life unfolding? What seemed to be taking place? And then if you were doing A, B, C, D, E before the trauma and after the trauma, you could only do A or B, I would know what the missing pieces were. And I would be able to say, okay, so let's back up before, we can do some resourcing, and we're going to build in a platform that will be able to process this single incident trauma and move it on through. Um, that type of realizing that that trauma has a story that is verifiable is what separates it from developmental trauma. When someone has developmental trauma, let's go back. Where does it begin? I believe that developmental trauma begins multiple generations back, that you inherit the incomplete traumas. Incomplete trauma means that I have a trauma and I don't process it through. I hold on to that trauma for some reason. That trauma now changes my DNA. It changes it, it attaches to DNA coming through, and I pass it on generationally. So that inherited trauma comes in. So we really don't have a story about that. We start having feelings, but we're like, what are these feelings about? What what do these feelings even mean? Why all of a sudden is this happening to me? Or it's already set as place in our life and our development that we're not even aware it's there. It's a missing piece that's not missing because we never knew. We don't even realize that we've surrendered that part of ourselves to that bit of trauma that we inherited. And then we move forward and we can get into conception. What was happening at conception? Was everybody happy at conception? Those kind of looking at conception and going, okay, here comes conceptual trauma. What does it look like? Uh, you can ask yourself, I oftentimes will ask classes or groups of people when I'm speaking, I'm saying, what was your father thinking about at the moment of your conception? Or what was your mother thinking about at the moment of your conception? And then realize how that plays into our life and how that affects us going forward. And it can be really quite uh, almost discombobulating just to figure out, oh, yeah, well, that was happening. And now this is happening in my life. And then after conception, from that moment of conception, things start growing so rapidly. We do most of our growth is all during utero, during those 9 months from conception to birth. And we know that in that first trimester, it's so important. is so important to look at and say, what was going on with the mom? What was happening in the first trimester? Um, was she married? Was she excited about the birth? Was she living in a dangerous location or a dangerous community? Was there any sort of overt hostility coming towards her? Was her relationship domestic violence? Was the world changing really fast around her and she couldn't quite get her balance with how the world was changing? All of those things that are possible, we know that early fear paralysis, that primitive reflex, those primitive reflex that teach us in the first trimester, the primitive, the fear paralysis comes in and it says, get out of the way to the fetus. And the fetus moves physically. And after repeated times, we know that trauma just is going to stay present because babies and infants, we don't have, there's not a whole lot of things they can do. They're not very good at running and they can't very well fight. So, they're moving towards freeze. And that's how we get to freeze, is we go through those series of defenses and we look at those and we think, Stephen Porges started the whole concept of social engagement, where we can talk our way through it. We can say, this is really scary, but I need to, catch a ride with this person to the gas station because I'm out of gas, and I can use social engagement. And if I keep talking, I can manage the situation. And then we go into fight, flight, freeze, those reactions that are organically embedded within all of us. And it's out of these fight, flight, and freeze that we create these survival parts. Not in the way to say, oh, you must have multiple personality disorder, which, is now called dissociative identity disorder, but, looking at it and go, yeah, we have survival parts and their whole job, they have one job. And the job that they come to with is to keep us alive, for us to survive no matter what. No matter what, they're going to keep us alive. And so I pause for a moment and I think, that's a lot of responsibility. And those parts, those early parts, begin by coming through it. Maybe it's social engagement. Maybe that social engagement part shows up, and as therapists, we may think, oh, it's so difficult to work with XYZ because all XYZ wants to do is talk. They talk and they talk and they talk and they talk. And so we go, okay, all right. So social engagement, when it becomes more of a survival part, maybe it's involved with talking. Maybe it's involved with left brain activity, because that's where conversation, most of it will come out of that left brain, and we're trying to analyze or figure it out. But with developmental trauma, we back up and we look at that. We go, okay, so we skip fight, we skip flight, and social engagement doesn't really work really well. We have social engagement. We have coo language. We can coo. We can do some of these things, but protest is not likely. And survival is not likely in those early. So we're looking at in utero, and there can be ruptures in utero. There can be things that happen in utero. Even though we were there and we participated, we're not going to remember. And so we come forward and we're born, and a lot of things can happen in that birth process, getting ready to be born, whether we're in a Hollywood type of birth where we make an appointment and we go in and have a C-section on Friday morning, and the infant's never had any chance to go through labor. There's nothing there. So they're missing things they're supposed to have. And with developmental trauma, that's part of it. We don't know if it's something happened to them or if they're missing something because we don't have an explicit story. My explicit story of my birth and my conception and my time in utero, it's not my story. I may say this happened to me and my mom was doing this and my dad was doing this and my sister was doing that. I can build this wonderful story. I can create a story that is just can identify and help me to support whatever behavior I'm experiencing later on in life. But the truth is, we don't know what happened to us. And we think, well, our mom would, or, somebody would, maybe an aunt would, maybe someone, but it's hard because moms can't remember. They don't remember every detail. They don't know all the things that happened. They know some of what happened, and there can be some very powerful information and knowledge that can be obtained in the story from what your mom said or your father said or your adoptive parent told you. Whatever information's coming forward begins to build a supportive narrative. A supportive narrative is what I create so that I can use it more as a defense or an explanation for my behavior. It's not the same as an explicit, this is what happened. I remember when I was conceived and I remember when. It's not that way. And what happens when we have developmental trauma, it's like we're in this veil of darkness. So, how does it work? If you're working in a veil of darkness as a clinician, and there's no clear roadmap, where are we going? Where do we hope to get to? And how can we be sure what did or did not occur in the process of development? We don't know. So there's lots of different ideas about that. There's lots of people that rely on archetypal bodies, like, oh, well, your body does this, so this means this. And yeah, there is some truth to a lot of that. Without a doubt, yeah, we could get into patterns, but are those DNA developments or are they created because of lifestyle? We don't know that for sure. So we're looking at this, and the question I always get, or frequently anyway, I don't know, I don't always like the word always, but frequently I get the question of, well, what does this mean, Steve? What do you think this means? What does it mean when my foot wiggles? What does it mean when this happens or that happens? And understanding that the answer is fluid. The answer is always fluid. I laugh and I say, oh, there's always 10 answers to every question. Every question has these 10 answers. And so any question on any given day could be answered differently. And so when we're working in developmental trauma and someone says to me, what does this mean? It just makes sense to me. It took me a while to even understand this because I trained Rogerian initially in graduate school, Carl Rogers' work, and Albert Ellis, of all people. Did some work with Albert Ellis and moved on and later became a play therapist, worked in adoptions, worked with dyadic developmental psychotherapy with Dan Hughes, did all of this work building up to work with the younger parts, to be able to understand how to work. We didn't even call them survival parts at all. We were really coming in there and just realizing that, something was wrong, but what was it? So moved on and then later became, met Kathy Kane, who is um, on faculty with somatic experiencing. Went to her training for advance and went immediately and took her touch skills training class the next month after advance, because it was the first time I realized that maybe this touch, maybe coming in and using touch instead of, the only touch I had ever trained in prior to that was holding therapy. You hold someone, or and you cause them to scream, and through this scream they break down, and in that breakdown they come into an awareness of themselves. And that never felt right to me. I actually despised it and hated it. I never saw an advantage there. So I started looking closer and I started working with touch. And then I thought, touch works great. I need to keep developing. And so I just kept moving forward and going, okay, there's no story. We're in the darkness. So what's missing? And trust came in. And I went, okay, how are we going to create trust with a system that has never trusted? And that was the big awakening too, is to realize, oh, it never trusted. It may have pretended to trust in order to stay safe. Social engagement, sometimes I think of it as that's how we protect ourselves, but that's how we also come in and maybe we're not telling the whole truth. Maybe there's a bit of a lie there. Maybe there's a bit of submissiveness. We go on when we're looking at fight, flight, and freeze, and we know that, oh, yeah, there's a submissive part that shows up. And that submissive part is, I'm going to do what I need to do to stay safe. So maybe that makes me a people pleaser. Maybe it means I'm going to really watch you closely. And through my own hypervigilance, I can tell when it's safe to approach you or when it's safe not to approach you. I can do all of these things. And using the social engagement and really thinking of it, because I think that we think about it being ventral based, that meaning that in the polyvagal, in the ventral, we're able to communicate. But I also believe that the implicit memory ties into that social engagement piece. And we create a story that means you're going to like me. So I started looking at clients I was working with, and I kept going, they trust me, they like me, I'm a good person, I'm a good therapist, we're all moving through something. But when I realized that that wasn't true, that they learned relationally how to be in relationship to keep it safe. They knew the going back and forth, and they began to look at it. And they knew what to do. And that subconscious development had come on way, way early. Those survival parts went, okay, this is what I need to do. I can do this. I can pull it off. I can make it happen. And then that question of, if they don't trust me, can they heal? Can anyone heal when you're existing in a system or in a place where you can't, trust someone? And I thought about Bruce Perry, who's a psychiatrist, psychologist, developmental specialist. He's out of the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, Texas, has done amazing work in the area. And he, in a training I went to, had talked about IQ being affected, that our trauma pushes and drops our IQ. and realizing that in order to learn, in order to be in relationship, people were really having to take all of that energy of learning and they were splitting it up because the energy of survival was greater than the energy of learning. So I would be working with someone and they would say, oh, um, when I went to graduate school, I had to read the book 10 times. Or when I went to first grade, it took me a long time to learn to read. It took me a long time to learn to extract information out of lectures and figure out what am I supposed to hold on to and what am I not. And so looking at life as this full circle, we begin to realize that something is different here in our story. So, how am I going to build trust? How am I going to bring trust back around? How is that trust going to happen? You know, I could get out of bed in the middle of the night, my room be pitch black dark inside, totally dark, and not be able to see anything. Do I trust that I'm not going to trip? No. We put our hands out, we put our foot out, we feel around. Is it okay to move through? So even moving around relationally by ourselves, in relationship to ourselves, that trust has to be there. So when I think about working in the dark, that's every client I see, everybody. And so is there a light? What's the light? Where can I bring lightness in? And I think that lightness started when I realized there's no trust here. We may be in relationship, but it's a relationship without trust. Maybe that's the same relationship the mother was in with the parent. Maybe it was the relationship the mother was in with the world. I don't know. But here we are. And we start working and we have to build trust. So understanding the power of resistance. Clients show up every day. And maybe last week they were right there and they did a big piece of work and everything began to change. And then the next week they show up and they're like totally resistant. What happened here? I believe that with trust, that when we start moving forward with trust, we're going to go back a whole lot more. We talk about healing developmental trauma is 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. I think trust is 2 steps backwards and 1 step forward. I think it is even greater difficulty to establish and build that trust in the relationship. And understanding that I have to lose all my expectations as a clinician. I have to say, your outcome is going to be your outcome. When a client says, how will I know when I'm done with therapy? You'll know. I won't know because I may be done with you way before you're done. Because that may be how my system works. Maybe my system says, okay, I can't take anymore. You need to go away. But really building that trust there's the key coming in, when you can really see that the client almost has a sense of relief when they see you. And so we start to build this trust through regulation and the autonomic nervous system. We think about trust, regulation. How does that work? And we know that we have to have a sense of self-regulation and we have a sense of co-regulation, and auto-regulation. We're looking at this, we're going, okay, so how's all that going to work? We think, well, everybody must have self-regulation, but they don't. Self-regulation can be as flawed as any other part of the system, but it's working for the person. When I think about self-regulation, I always think about a story that seems to make sense to me. And that is, you go into a grocery store and you're standing there in line and something happens. Maybe it's a smell, maybe it's a discussion in front of you, and you get anxious and you have to leave. It's like the autonomic nervous system takes over. And it does take over because there's a part of it that says, in order to be able to run or to escape or to do this, we might need to be, the warning sign signal may need to act faster, or it may act slower. And so we're standing in a line, and next thing we know, we're in our car and we're driving away from the market because we can't tolerate it. Or we find ourselves just going, oh, and we get that explosion coming in and we can't control it, or it feels as if we can't. That kind of dysregulation is where a lot of us and a lot of folks who have experienced developmental trauma, that's where they live the majority of their life. Co-regulation isn't safe. So imagine for a moment, just think for a second, here I am, and I don't trust, and I'm in a world that I really don't understand, and I'm not sure who to trust because I don't even know if I really understand the word trust enough to even know who to trust. And I look out and I'm going, okay, well, who do I need to be friends with? Where do I need to go? And someone one time said that if you walk into a crowded gymnasium and it's full of people, the person you're attracted to immediately to go up to talk to is the person you should run from. Because that person that you're moving into may be just like you. And so backing up and looking at this dysfunctional self-regulation, realizing that it's created this survival self. The survival self is there. And when I look at it from that and I go, okay, how am I going to move it? I need to build regulation. I need to build some sense of trust to come in. Something needs to change. And through touch, I believe we can establish regulation. Sometimes one of the complaints I've heard along the way about touch is that, oh yeah, you make the client dependent on you. They feel better when you're there, when they're there with you, but it doesn't always last. And there's some truth to that. Just think for a moment. When we were born and we were infants, if the world would have gone right, if everything would have been as, it was intended, we would have had a caring, nurturing, loving caretaker there to take care of us, who created a world where we were the most important and surrounded us with support and surrounded us with love. And so we get into therapy and we begin to build this relationship with our clients, and we're building trust. Boom. Sometimes they're going to go, wait a minute, am I falling in love with my therapist? What kind of love is this? Because there's a little bit of confusion. So we want to be sure we do a little psychoeducation around that it's normal to be cared about. And as our client, you should be the center of the attention in the room. It shouldn't be on me. I'm here to support you. Everything's about you. So we begin to build this trust somatically. And I started out using intuition, or just thinking, okay, this is what's happening and I need to move on. And as time went on, I realized in developmental trauma, it worked better to create patterns, because the patterns are where we need to repair. We need to come in this scaffolding of development, and we have to create these patterns. And one of the earliest, of course, is going to be trust. So in order to build that, the pattern that I established through my work, through a lot of trial and error, is let's do it by a clock. Let's say, okay, I'm going to ask you beforehand, is it okay? We're going to be here, we're going to be there, we're going to be here. And then I broke it down and I started measuring by clock and moving to where I really could create a sense of patterning. That's what I wanted, this greater sense of patterning to come in so that trust would not be something way out. And through that process was able to, for the client to get to a place where their self-regulation became more abundant for them, more clear, more clarity. They were able to say, oh, okay, I can calm myself. That's what self-regulation is about. It's not about my reaction to everyone else. It's about my reaction to me. Because clients with developmental trauma oftentimes don't trust themselves. So taking the time to build a trusting relationship is the key to healing developmental trauma in my greatest of all experiences. And at this point, I've touched, 30,000 different people that have experienced developmental trauma. And I can see how it changes. Where it becomes more difficult when you're working from building trust and building a relationship is that understanding that sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes the defenses within the client themselves prevents them from moving forward. It prevents them from further healing. It says, no, I'm not going to change. And sometimes that resistance can be so great that we see it week after week and we don't know what to do. And the client's saying, I'm not getting any better. And you're saying, oh, it must be me. And, because clinicians tend to want to blame themselves. But backing that up and looking at it and going, wait a minute. If you're healing within a window of tolerance, you wouldn't be having these mass disruptions. It'd be very gentle and calm, and that's how it's supposed to go. So, in building trust, me not pushing your system is a sign of trust, isn't it? Me not coming in there and going, you got to do this. Let's get this going. We're going to push you over. We're going to do all of these things. Not necessary. Pull it back. Look at it from that place of understanding that, oh, yeah, I just need to be on your schedule, not on my schedule. My schedule is going to be kept as far as time and showing up on time, not canceling my appointments, being clear with my clients, and working through to build a safe environment. But once you're in the room as the client, maybe your system's going to go a bit slower. Maybe it's going to go micro slow today. Maybe next week it goes super fast and you're going to have a reaction. I used to say that anything that happens 48 hours after a session is important to note, that that's probably related to your healing. And then I started saying 48 hours after a session, you could actually feel worse. And then I got to where I started saying 48 hours after a session, we're going to be watching what's going on. You could feel worse. That's totally possible. Or maybe you're not going to feel anything at all, and that's okay too. And being able to support the healing, they don't remember. I wasn't there. I don't remember. And we're working in the dark. So take your time when you're working with someone and get out of your head that everything has to be boom, boom, boom. Healing is going to take place and it has to be within 6 days or 6 months or 6 years. Healing is not going to happen before the client has trust, before they've established a healing, loving relationship with you as the clinician. Doesn't happen. They'll start to get sparks, but it takes a while. Find trust in the darkness. Not easy. Not easy for a clinician, not easy for a client. Okay, I'm going to answer some questions. Liam, you want to read them to me because I have a bit trouble reading.
And with big trouble trusting.
I understand. Me too.
Um, I got two questions in, Steve, in email, so I'll go to them first. So the first question is from Margaret. Hello, Margaret. When speaking about nonverbal trauma, would Steve be able to talk some bit about the impact trauma has of losing a twin sibling in Urito and his approach in working with this particular type of non-verbal trauma, please?
When we get into on here, that's going to be a more difficult thing to step into, because of the uniqueness of that type of developmental trauma. We do talk about it in the training, and there's a lot more room in the training, to be able to ask those sorts of questions to get into that. But it is definitely very much affects your sense of safety, your sense of well-being. All of those feelings are right there with you and the twin. And it's that relational trauma. And if you lose your twin, you're the very first relationship you really have. It makes it very difficult to establish that next relationship, even if your primary caretaker is Mary Poppins. It's hard to establish it. And so there's lots of reactions around that for sure.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And the next question then is, do you have any experience working with ME or CFS, which is chronic fatigue syndrome? And if yes, how many cases have you worked with? Have they been housebound or even bedridden for many years? How many sessions or how long can it take for these clients to have improvements? And how can progress be verified?
I believe 100% that anyone who suffers from addiction, anyone who has autoimmune issues, chronic fatigue syndrome falls into those categories. All of those are a result of an exhausted nervous system from developmental trauma that they create. It's hard to imagine, but their defensive accommodation, they're creating these ways of trying not to use all their energy. And in the process of creating that, they're creating something that takes more energy and appears to someone on the outside, and the inside. But chronic fatigue syndrome, I could almost say that if we put it on a spectrum, if we didn't just come under the category and say, okay, this is chronic fatigue syndrome and this is what it's going to do, but we put it on a spectrum of fatigue or tired or lack of energy, all the way down to bedridden, housebound, and it's more of that whole spectrum, I would be hard pressed that anyone that I've ever seen wasn't on that spectrum, on that chronic fatigue spectrum. Um, I think that it takes time, because you have to work in the same way you do with anyone else. You have to build trust. You have to begin to bring on a sense of regulation into that system. And that takes time and effort. I have worked with people where I've had to go to their home and work with them in their home, because they just couldn't even get out of bed at all, or they were in a nursing facility and had to take care of them. Um, Results can be measured in something different. Is it like, this week the same as the week before, or was it different? And if they say, oh, it was something different, it begins to shift and change, and we know that healing is occurring. And so my belief and my faith and my trust that the work is working is going to be enough that it does work. We do see work. So my attitude also plays into the client's healing. and being able to take our time um, and really explore, what the client sees as healing more so than mine. I could say, oh, I want you to get up and walk and run around the block 3 times. And maybe their goal is just to be able to hold a fork. So I really want to focus on them and building that system back up. And yes, we do get the same as we do with addictions. We get change, and that change is notable. I've had people that were bedridden who've gotten out of bed and gone back to work. We have to look at that in the States because people go on SSI, which is Social Security, because of their illness, and they haven't worked in years. And we want to be sure that how when they're healing, that they're also, we're looking at them as a total person through Maslow's eyes. Can they support themselves if they get out of bed? What are we going to do here? So a lot of negotiation takes place in that healing process.
Okay, thanks, Steve. The next question is from Mark. Hello, Mark. How to overcome when people are so afraid of touch because of what they have gone through that they are not daring to try TEB?
Well, what's most important is let's just sit with that. I mean, that was a pretty brave statement, right? That's pretty brave. The client has showed up and said, this is where I am. And in that process, we have showed up and said, this is what we want to try. So if the client says, I'm afraid, I'm not willing to try touch, and the touch I'm talking about is very different than a massage. And it's very different than chiropractic touch. And it's very different than osteopath touch. It's very different than orthobionomy touch. It's a very different kind of touch because we really are just touching. So I'm touching in the area of a kidney, adrenal gland, or I'm touching at the brainstem, or I'm touching at an ankle, but I'm not manipulating and I'm not applying pressure. It's just a very basic touch coming in here. So if I tell the client, I say, this is the treatment that I would like to go forward. So I'm going to show them, I want to show them a drawing. I want to show them what the window of tolerance looks like. I want to show them about defensive accommodations. I want to be sure that they're as educated as possible in the process and understand that we're working in the dark, that we're building trust, we're building this relationship. And I might start off with saying, do you think it'd be okay if we both sat next to each other? Or would it be okay if I sit here and I think about intentionally touching you on your right kidney? Would that be okay? And if they're so fearful and they say no, 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 then I might get to the place. What that tells me, first of all, it tells me that their defensive accommodation is they're controlling the world, right? And by understanding that they're controlling the world by preventing or changing or what they're asking for, then I might say to them, why don't you touch me? Would it be all right for you to put your hand on my hand? Can you just lay your hand on top of my hand? Or can you just touch your finger to my finger, your pinky finger to my finger? Would it be okay if I use the back of my hand to touch you? There's less feeling on the back of our hands. And really, it's like negotiating formula. Not all babies like all the same formulas. They don't all like the same milk. They don't all like the same breast milk. So It's really about understanding and supporting the individuality and just taking our time with the client, not rushing, establishing that they're really afraid and and that fear is real, and I have to respect it. And it just might take longer to get them to the table or get them, maybe I'll never get to the table. Maybe we'll just work on the couch sitting next to each other, but just take our time. And I'm aware that we have a lot more Q&As, a lot more questions. We're going to be back again. When are we back again, Liam? Next week or?
No, we're back. We're back again in January. So
we don't do any more this month?
No. So what we can do is people that we don't get to tonight, which there are going to be a lot of people, and there's really a lot of great questions. So if anybody has any specific needs about what they'd like to learn about developmental trauma, what they'd like to learn about TEB, please send the questions to me. My email address again is liam, Liam, @pcpsi.ie. And what we'll do for the January webinar, we'll formulate it specific to questions.
Yeah.
And I'll make an agenda that will address all the questions and any patterns of questions, and we can take it from there.
Yeah.
It's about 8 minutes to 8 now, Steve. Do you need to go, or have you another few minutes?
I have just a couple more minutes and then I need to go out. I have a Q&A here for Ohio training.
Okay, so will we take 2 more questions and?
Let's take one more and see how that goes, and we'll figure out. So
okay. So this is from Sinead. I work with teens at a school with lots of domestic violence histories. My question is, have you any tips to get people out of freeze?
Well, domestic violence histories. I'm assuming that would be from the parent to the child, or is it between the teens? If it's parent to child, it's probably developmental trauma, more than likely. Some of the things when you're working with teens is to get them, first of all, you're going to have to meet them through YouTube. You're going to have to meet them through music. You're going to have to meet them through movies. You're going to have to do some other things to build them up. If you're in that school situation, sometimes you're going to have to do a sensory diet type plan can help, where you go get them out of class and maybe all you're going to do is walk around the building. Maybe you're just going to walk down a hallway and back with them and then put them back into class. And you start out with little short pieces. If you have a rubber ball, maybe in an office, you can sit and just play back and forth with the ball. It takes a while with teenagers. It's interesting. You can do a lot of work with little toddlers. You can do great work with infants. You can do good work with elementary age. When you get into teens, that's probably the most difficult. And then you pick back up in the 20s and you can do great work. In the teens, you really just got to take your time, build a relationship, split some biscuits or something, figuring out how to build a relationship, but truly little bitty spurts, going to get someone out of class and saying, let's go for a walk, and just walk maybe to the office of the school and back to their classroom. Those kind of little things. Having the teacher preset something with the teacher to have a sealed envelope, and the teacher give it to the student and say, will you take this to see Sinead or to see Miss Taylor? Take it to her office for me, please. And just have them bring that envelope to you like there's really something in it. It's probably just a folded up piece of paper, and it's sealed so they can't see inside of it, so that they can start to develop a relationship with you. But there's no huge quick tips except to pull back your lens and just see it that, okay, this is much greater. So if I get them into my office and I'm working with them, maybe I'm just going to have them practice turning on their hips, slowly turning on their hips in a chair, just to where they can start freeing up their bodies, freeing up that fascia. Because that fascia, if you have developmental trauma, you have tight fascia or you have extremely loose fascia. But very few people are going to have good fascia. So you want to do some exercises around that. But we definitely need people working in schools. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to say goodbye for now.
Okay.
I really appreciate being here today, Liam. I wish I could answer every single question, but in this amount of time, I just don't have the energy. And in January, we'll come back and we'll do nothing but questions, and we'll do a whole thing in questions. Okay.
Absolutely. And as I say, if people just want to send in the question, any specific needs people have in relation to the developmental trauma, specifically around using touch or using intentional touch. And then we're going to have another webinar in February. And in the last webinar, what we're going to talk about is specifically intentional touch.
Yes.
Which is really after taking off since the pandemic. So we can actually do the touch work over Zoom, and it works kind of super well.
Really well, much better than I could have ever imagined.
Absolutely. And we're going to, and on that, if you're okay with it, Steve, we're going to do a demo.
Sure.
You can do a demo on me and give people an appreciation of what it looks like on the screen.
I would love to do that. And I'm going to have to bug out of here. And thank you so much for having me. Hello to everyone from wherever you are in the world. I miss not getting to see everyone because the way it's set up, I don't know who's here and not here. But for those of you I know, hello and big hugs. And those I don't know, hello. And I look forward to getting to know you. And we'll see you next time, Liam. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I want to thank everybody that joined us. And just to say again that if you're interested in the training, that it's on in 2021. It'll be on May, September, and December. They're very small groups. We like to keep it small for quality of training. So if you are interested, it's probably best to sign up sooner rather than later. And Robert, you might put up the information about the training. And just finally, then, if you do want a CPD cert, there's a link there as well, and you can get a cert. So really appreciate everyone joining, and hopefully we'll see everybody again in January. And just to let you know, there's a free webinar next week with Deb Dana, and we'll be sending out details of that shortly. So for now, bye and thank you.